Thomas Metzinger, a German philosopher, has reshaped how we think about the mind, the self, and the nature of consciousness. In his seminal work The Ego Tunnel, Metzinger makes an astonishing claim: the self that we believe to be real, permanent, and central to our existence is, in fact, an illusion. Can you imagine how this idea upends centuries of philosophical debate and human understanding? The self, Metzinger argues, is nothing more than a mental model, a virtual construct created by the brain to help us function in the world. But this is not just a philosophical argument. Metzinger connects it with modern neuroscience and ancient practices like Buddhist meditation, creating a framework that invites us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about who we are. Metzinger's background and his influences, a fusion of philosophy and neuroscience. Born in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1958, Thomas Metzinger has always been fascinated by the human mind. His academic journey began with a deep interest in both philosophy and science, fields that he would later merge in his explorations of consciousness. From an early age, Metzinger seemed driven by the big questions: what is the mind? What is the self? How can subjective experience be understood scientifically? These questions led him to study not only philosophy but also neuroscience, cognitive science, and psychology, fields that would shape his later work. What makes Metzinger so unique is his interdisciplinary approach. He is not content to remain within the abstract world of philosophical thought. Instead, he seeks to connect those abstract ideas with empirical evidence from science. Isn't it incredible when someone can straddle both worlds, philosophy and science, and bring them into meaningful conversation? Metzinger is a master of this, and it's one of the reasons his work has had such a profound impact on the field of consciousness studies. Metzinger's philosophical influences are diverse. He draws on the German idealist tradition, with philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer shaping his early thoughts. Kant's idea that we do not have direct access to reality but instead experience the world through the filter of our cognitive faculties resonates deeply with Metzinger's later arguments in The Ego Tunnel. Schopenhauer's insights into the nature of desire, suffering, and selfhood also align closely with Metzinger's view of the self as a transient construct. In addition, Metzinger was heavily influenced by contemporary analytic philosophers such as Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers, who grapple with the hard problem of consciousness: how and why does subjective experience arise from physical processes in the brain? Metzinger's work is, in many ways, a response to this central question, but Metzinger doesn't stop at Western philosophy. He looks eastward, too. Buddhist philosophy, particularly its teachings on anatta, non-self, and impermanence, plays a critical role in Metzinger's thinking. In Buddhism, the self is seen not as a permanent, fixed entity, but as a collection of ever-changing mental and physical processes. This idea aligns perfectly with Metzinger's notion of the self as an illusion, a temporary and constructed phenomenon rather than an enduring, independent entity. Isn't it fascinating how these two worlds, modern Western philosophy and ancient Eastern wisdom, come together in Metzinger's work, The Ego Tunnel, a revolutionary theory of consciousness? The central thesis of The Ego Tunnel is as daring as it is profound. Metzinger argues that the self, the very core of our being, is not real. Instead, it's a kind of virtual reality, a mental model created by the brain to help us interact with the world. Imagine living your entire life believing that you are an independent, autonomous individual, only to find out that this self is just a cognitive construct. How would that change the way you see yourself? Your relationships? Your responsibilities? Metzinger uses the metaphor of a tunnel to explain his theory. The ego tunnel refers to the narrow, filtered perspective through which we perceive the world. Our brains, Metzinger suggests, create a virtual model of the external world based on sensory input, memories, and emotions. This model is then presented to our conscious minds as reality, but it's not an accurate reflection of the external world. Instead, it's a heavily processed, filtered version of it. Just as we don't directly perceive the external world, we also don't directly perceive ourselves. The self that we experience is not the real us, it's merely a model that the brain has constructed. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Metzinger doesn't just stop at the idea that the self is an illusion. He goes further to argue that even our conscious experience of the world is a construction. That's right, according to Metzinger, consciousness itself is not a direct window into reality, but a carefully crafted virtual experience created by the brain. Our minds are like virtual reality machines, generating a subjective version of the world that we mistakenly believe to be objective reality. Isn't that a staggering thought? It makes you wonder if we're ever truly in touch with reality or if we're just living inside this elaborate mental simulation, the illusion of the self. A radical shift in understanding. At the heart of Metzinger's theory is the claim that the self is an illusion. This might sound shocking. After all, we all feel as though we are individual, autonomous beings with a continuous identity that persists through time. But Metzinger argues that this feeling of being a separate self is nothing more than a cognitive trick. The brain creates a narrative, integrating our thoughts, memories, and sensory experiences into a coherent story that we perceive as I. But this I doesn't really exist, at least, not in the way we think it does. Metzinger's theory aligns closely with Buddhist teachings on the nature of the self. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta teaches that there is no permanent, unchanging self. Instead, what we think of as the self is a collection of ever-changing mental and physical processes, thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations, that come together to create the illusion of a stable identity. Isn't it incredible that Buddhism, which is thousands of years old, had already arrived at a concept that modern neuroscience and philosophy are only now beginning to explore in depth? What Metzinger adds to this ancient insight is a scientific explanation for how the brain creates this illusion. According to Metzinger, the brain generates what he calls a phenomenal self-model, which is a mental representation of the self. This self-model is what allows us to navigate the world and interact with others, but it's not an accurate reflection of reality. The self is not an entity that exists independently of the brain's processes, it's a model that the brain constructs to help us function. Isn't it humbling to realize that the you think you are is really just a story your brain is telling? Consciousness as a constructed phenomenon. What does it mean for reality? Metzinger doesn't stop at the self, he goes even further by claiming that consciousness itself is a constructed phenomenon. This is a radical departure from the traditional view of consciousness as a direct reflection of reality. According to Metzinger, our conscious experience of the world is not a straightforward perception of the external world but a heavily processed, filtered representation. The brain acts like a virtual reality machine, creating a subjective experience of the world that is not necessarily an accurate reflection of what's really out there. This idea has profound implications for how we understand reality. If our conscious experience is a construction, then what we perceive as reality is not the objective world, but a subjective version shaped by our brain's cognitive and neural processes. Metzinger suggests that what we call reality is not a single, objective experience shared by everyone, but a subjective construction that varies from person to person. Isn't that a mind-bending thought? It means that each of us is living in our own unique version of reality, shaped by our individual brains. Once again, we see a striking similarity between Metzinger's theory and Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhism, reality is seen as impermanent and constantly changing, and our perception of the world is shaped by our desires, attachments, and mental constructs. Buddhist teachings emphasize the illusory nature of reality, arguing that our perception of the world is distorted by our mental habits and emotional states. Metzinger's theory of consciousness echoes this perspective, suggesting that our experience of reality is not an objective truth, but a subjective construction shaped by the cognitive and neural processes of the brain. Meditation and the deconstruction of the ego, a path to freedom. One of the most compelling aspects of Metzinger's work is his exploration of meditation and its potential to deconstruct the ego. Metzinger is particularly interested in how meditation practices, especially those found in Buddhism, can offer us a way to step outside of the ego tunnel and see reality more clearly. Through practices like mindfulness and vipassana, meditators learn to observe their thoughts, emotions, and sensations without identifying with them. Over time, this allows them to see that the self is not a continuous, unified entity, but rather a collection of moment-to-moment experiences. For Metzinger, meditation is a powerful tool because it provides experiential evidence for the philosophical claim that the self is an illusion. When we meditate, we begin to see that our thoughts and emotions are not ours in the sense of belonging to a fixed self. Instead, they arise and pass away, like clouds drifting through the sky. Isn't it liberating to realize that the self is not something we have to cling to? Meditation offers us a way to loosen our grip on the ego, to let go of the illusion of a permanent, separate self, and to experience reality as it truly is, fluid, impermanent, and interconnected. The scientific and philosophical intersection with Buddhism, a new frontier. Metzinger's work is part of a broader movement in contemporary philosophy and science that seeks to explore the intersections between ancient wisdom and modern scientific inquiry. Both philosophy and science are increasingly looking to meditation and Buddhist practices as a way to gain new insights into the nature of consciousness and the self. In Buddhism, the goal of meditation is to realize the illusory nature of the self and attain a state of enlightenment, a direct, unfiltered experience of reality beyond the ego. Metzinger's work echoes this goal, suggesting that through meditation and scientific investigation, we can come to understand the self as a construct and gain a more accurate understanding of consciousness. In particular, the practice of mindfulness has gained widespread attention in the scientific community for its potential to alter the brain's functioning and change our perception of the self. Neuroscientific studies have shown that regular meditation can reduce the activity of the brain's default mode network, DMN, which is responsible for self-referential thoughts and the constant chatter of the ego. When the DMN quiets down, meditators often experience a state of egolessness, where the boundaries between self and world dissolve. Metzinger points to these findings as evidence that meditation can help individuals see through the illusion of the self and gain a more profound understanding of consciousness. Ethical implications of Metzinger's work. What happens when we see the self as an illusion? If the self is an illusion, as Metzinger argues, what does this mean for our moral and ethical lives? This is one of the most profound and challenging questions raised by Metzinger's work. Traditional ethical frameworks often rely on the idea of a stable, autonomous self that is responsible for its actions. But if the self is not real, if it's just a construct of the brain, then how do we think about moral responsibility? How do we understand personal identity? Isn't it dizzying to think about how this changes everything? Metzinger suggests that understanding the self as an illusion can actually lead to greater empathy and ethical behavior. When we realize that the boundaries between self and other are not fixed, that we are all interconnected, it becomes easier to act compassionately toward others. This ethical dimension of Metzinger's work is closely aligned with Buddhist philosophy, which teaches that the realization of non-self leads to a greater sense of responsibility and care for others. Isn't it beautiful to think that seeing through the illusion of the self can lead to a more compassionate and connected way of living? Challenges and criticisms of Metzinger's theory. Too reductionist? Of course, not everyone agrees with Metzinger's radical ideas. Some philosophers argue that Metzinger's reductionist approach to the self oversimplifies the complexities of personal identity. While Metzinger views the self as an illusion, others contend that the experience of selfhood, even if constructed, is essential to our moral and social lives. The self may not be an enduring entity, but it plays a crucial role in shaping our relationships, our sense of responsibility, and our ethical commitments. Moreover, while Metzinger draws heavily from Buddhist philosophy, some critics argue that he may oversimplify certain aspects of Buddhist teachings. For example, in Buddhism, the dissolution of the ego is not merely an intellectual understanding, but a transformative spiritual experience that leads to liberation from suffering. Metzinger's treatment of the self as an illusion may overlook the depth of this spiritual dimension, focusing more on the cognitive and philosophical aspects rather than the experiential and existential aspects of egolessness. Conclusion: Metzinger's lasting impact on philosophy, science, and spirituality. Thomas Metzinger's exploration of consciousness and the self in the ego tunnel is nothing short of revolutionary. His argument that the self is an illusion challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about personal identity, free will, and the nature of reality. By integrating insights from neuroscience, cognitive science, and Buddhist meditation practices, Metzinger offers a new framework for understanding consciousness, one that bridges the gap between science and spirituality. Metzinger's work invites us to reconsider our own experience of selfhood and consciousness. It encourages us to question the boundaries we place between ourselves and others and to explore new ways of thinking about identity, morality, and reality itself. Through meditation and scientific investigation, Metzinger suggests that we can come to understand the constructed nature of the self, leading to a more compassionate and ethical way of being in the world. In the end, Metzinger's work pushes the boundaries of academic inquiry and offers practical insights for living a more conscious and connected life. Isn't it exhilarating to think that by challenging our understanding of the self, we can open up new possibilities for how we relate to one another and the world? Metzinger's philosophy is not just a theory, it's a call to wake up to the deeper truths of our existence.